everybody. My name is Cindy Simon, and just a very quick background. I've been teaching for over 25 years, and I've taught at, well, I teach here at Rutgers. I've also taught at other state colleges, community colleges, and some of the big national online schools. I share this because I have been in a variety of different kinds of classrooms, in person, remote, online, and hybrid. So let's get started. Today, I want to share what my students taught me about their essay exam mistakes and ways to have them make fewer of them. So I'd like to ask everybody to start just as a point about my teaching style. I love participation. So in the chat, if you could just list some common ways students lose points answering questions on essay exams besides not knowing the actual answers or grammar mistakes. Let's see what folks come up with. We got one, poor citation. Okay, yes, not answering all parts of the question is a big one. Using too much time is a big one. Issues with writing, right? Thesis statements. Good. Other folks? They don't answer the question fully. So it looks like you guys are having the same kinds of experiences that I've had in my years of teaching. So this slide is titled Pitfalls of Multiple Part Essay Questions because most essay questions are multiple part, but this would hold true for any form of an essay question. As several of you have noted, students leave out parts of the question. Students focus too heavily on one part of the question while not giving sufficient time to other parts of the question, so they end up running out of time to answer the questions. Or students don't answer what is asked in the first place, either because they've wandered off topic and they leave out time, or because they haven't fully read the prompt, they haven't fully broken down the prompt, which was something that several folks wrote in the chat. So the question then becomes, how do we get to where we're going? I have a sample question here. And I use this as my teaching question. When I first started teaching, I gave my students an exam that had 2 essay questions on it. It's the last part of the exam. And this was one of them. This was for an introduction to political science class. And after the midterm, I would go over the exam and I would go over this question, and I would find that students had left out parts of the question and they hadn't focused on what was specifically being asked. And I would teach them what I'll show you later, which is a method of answering questions that was taught to me in high school by an AP history teacher who was obsessed with the idea of us being able to answer what we were asked in the time given on the AP US history exam. And so I taught this method to my students. And it took me about 4 semesters to figure out maybe I should do that lesson before the midterm. So here's the question. Provide 5 reasons people don't vote. State your opinion of those reasons and provide counter arguments for those reasons. In the chat, what do you think students lost points for on this question? Where do you think students went wrong? Anybody? Yeah, providing counter arguments was a big problem for the students. Some because they didn't really know how to construct counter arguments. Others because they didn't actually know what the word counter argument meant. And this, by the way, was initially, they could reach out and ask me, giving all 5 reasons. Yep. They don't have support for their reasons. Sometimes the reasons were so obvious they didn't need support, right? Someone saying someone was not of voting age, for example, is, kind of self-explanatory. It was more support for the counter arguments that were issues. So if we go back and we look at this, the question then becomes, so this was my experience. Students provided their opinions on or counter arguments for only some examples, right? We didn't have all 5 for each. Students provided something other than their opinion for the second part of the question. This was a huge problem. Let's say the argument was someone didn't vote because they were still 17. So your opinion of that reason would be it's a legitimate reason, it's a good reason, some adjective that expresses approval of that reason. Students had a very difficult time with this idea of just saying something was good or something was bad, or coming up with the adjective to describe the reason before expressing why it was their opinion, right? The underage voting one, that's a legitimate reason because it's illegal to vote underage. But they had trouble with the opinion. They would present counter arguments. They would present examples. My friend was 17, so he couldn't vote. But the idea of stating an opinion for some reason was very challenging to them. Students did not know what was meant by a counter argument and or how to construct them. Students left out parts of the question. So I found this both when I used this as a midterm question and when I've used it as a teaching question for how to answer midterm questions and final questions that had these essay formats. Because most people could really answer this without having any knowledge of political science or voting, or, if you live in a democracy, we can kind of get to at least the first two parts of this fairly well. So how do we fix these? This is fix number one. Separate questions into their parts, right? So I've done this as A, B, and C. I did not initially try this as a fix to this question because it never occurred to me that doing this would make a difference. I'm one of those people that if you give me driving directions or cooking directions and they're in a paragraph, the car gets to where it's going and the food gets cooked. However, a lot of people prefer driving directions and cooking directions line by line by line. And what I've told my students is if you're one of those people, if that's the way your brain works, when you're given questions that are in paragraph form like this, you need to break them out line by line by line so that you don't miss any part of the question. And in fact, I tried this experiment in one of my classes. I took some of my essay exam questions and I put them like this instead of in a paragraph form. What do you think the outcome of that experiment was? Anybody in chat? Yep. Kelly has it. Students answered all parts of what they were asked. They may not have answered it correctly depending on what the questions were, but they at least attempted to answer all parts of the question. Now, sometimes you still had students not necessarily answering what was asked. This question, again, you could still, the folks that didn't get to state the opinion part, right? So they weren't saying it was good, it was bad, it was legitimate. They weren't giving you those adjectives that were judgments. They would still make that same mistake, but at least they weren't leaving it out. Now, I will say that this question I just divided up this way. If I was going to actually do this on a test and divide it up, I would have rephrased the second. I would have rephrased the second and third here, because the first one says provide 5 reasons for people who do not vote. The second one says state your opinion of those reasons. Students often will leave out. They won't do all 5 reasons because it doesn't say state your opinion for each of these reasons. And sometimes even when you say each, I've run into many of instructions where I will tell students in my online classes that you post your initial response to a discussion question, you must post 2 responses to other posts for each discussion question. And I'll still have students that when there's 2 discussion questions in a week will go, but I posted 2 responses, 1 for each question. That's not what the instructions say. So sometimes underlining the word each in your actual question or in your actual instructions will again help the students to focus, because they're not focused. They're skimming. There's a lot of research that shows that students, because of the amount of information that we're exposed to, just skim through everything. So that may help them to focus more. And again, the third one here, I would have changed to provide a counter argument for each of the 5 reasons you've given. So what's fix number 2? Fix number 2 is also something I didn't try initially, because when I went to school back in the Stone Ages, rubrics were not a thing, right? I didn't experience rubrics in my college classes. I didn't experience rubrics in my high school classes. That isn't to say that we didn't have things that said 2 points each or something like that. But this is another way to help students focus on what they're being asked. So again, this is divided into its 3 parts. Provide 5 reasons people do not vote, 1 point for each reason for a total of 5 points. So again, now I'm focused. Okay, I have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get the points. State your opinion of these reasons. Now here it says 1 point for your opinion about each reason for a total of 5 points. That solves the problem I had in the last slide, getting them to focus on each. Provide counter arguments for those reasons. And again, this gives you the exact way of grading. What are the advantages and disadvantages to using rubrics like this? Anybody in the chat? Okay, there's a lot of clutter. Consistency and transparency in grades, that's always a good thing. Other folks, we're a small group. I so wish people could talk. um, Interesting. The comment about combining objective and subjective answers. Of course, that doesn't say whether that's advantage or disadvantage for a rubric. It's a checklist for students to follow. That's helpful. By the way, it's also a checklist for professors to follow when we're grading. We know exactly what we're grading on. Yep, students are clear on what's being graded. Those are all good answers. I will note two things on this in addition to what's been said. The first is that sometimes when you use rubrics like this, you end up with scenarios where students may end up with lower grades than they otherwise might have had you been grading differently. One of the schools that I teach at, where I'm given all the assignments and the rubrics and everything, it's one of these national based online schools. They're all like that, but the rubric basically says, for the discussion questions, below expectations if you leave out any part of the question. And so you'll have students that will give really good answers to, 6 of the 8 parts of the question, and they leave out 2 parts. And it's kind of like, you may not want their grade to be lowered that much. They also have a very hard final paper. And again, there's 4 distinct sections of the paper, and a lot of students have difficulty with the 4th section. It's very high order thinking kind of thing that's got multiple steps in logic. And a lot of times students they'll just not do it at all. And the consequence is that literally the highest grade you could get there is a B minus. So if you've done anything else incorrect, such as, not APA formatted completely perfectly or something like that, you end up with a C. And again, the people who usually can do everything else perfectly do get points on that section. So the folks that are doing the B paper otherwise may end up with, a low C or D because they've not done that section. So be aware when using rubrics in general that yes, it can help ensure students meet, do all parts of an assignment, but if they don't do it correctly, it may lower their grades in a way that you don't intend it to. It's particularly the difference between a C and, that D or something like that. So I offer that just as a kind of warning. So one of the things, if we had planned for this in advance, I'd actually ask folks to think about some of their essay questions that they have on their exams. Because these are the ways that you can change the formatting of your questions. The last thing I'm going to show you is something you can teach your students. How might you guys change some of the formatting of your questions? And you can put it in chat and see what folks come up with. I'm going to give you a little bit of time here because you have to actually think about this. What might you do differently? Oh, that's a great. So somebody asked, do you find that you get more shallow answers in the format because they are focused on all elements and not the content? Not necessarily. That goes to the timing part of questions, right? Students spending enough time answering questions. I've actually found that if you break it into A, B, C, D, like I did for this one, what ends up happening sometimes is that you have great in-depth answers for A, B, and C, and then they ran out of time for D, right? Because they're not allocating how much time they have to answer each part. But yeah, I mean, I've seen the reverse when you don't break the questions apart or you don't use the rubrics, where you've got these really in-depth answers to half the question, and then the other half isn't answered. And I remember when I was a teaching assistant, when I was working on my PhD, and this became kind of I wasn't giving clear instructions by the faculty member I was working for in terms of grading. And I had always graded, I looked for certain things in the answer, even if I didn't have a formal rubric. I always looked for, did you answer all parts of the question? How were your answers? So if you didn't answer 50% of the question, in my mind, you only earned, even if you answered the other 50% extraordinarily well, you only earned 50% of the points. Needless to say, the faculty member I was grading for had a different opinion. She thought, well, they wrote a great essay. What they have here is awesome. Maybe they ran out of time, or they. So she thought that those were B's, and because oh yeah, they had a little bit of stuff missing. So yeah, it's an interesting question. So this idea of giving answers of what makes the full credit answer versus a partial credit answer is a great idea. Can folks think of ways that might be challenging though for subject matter tests? If you're looking that they show you that they have a certain set of knowledge, how might giving prior to the test, not after, but prior to the test, how might giving those examples present a challenge? So one of the ways it may present a challenge is if you're testing simple knowledge, kind of the lower order things on Bloom's taxonomy, it's hard to give this sample answers because then you're giving them the answers. We've already have a problem with students going online and looking for answers. And I always find it amusing, by the way, when they copy answers online in some of these large schools where they kind of repeat the classes and they repeat the tests and stuff. So they find stuff online and they copy it, and it's terrible. It's like, guys, this isn't what you want to be copying. You shouldn't be copying anything, but this isn't what you want to copy. Yeah, the what won't be an answer is I do that too. In the discussions, just say things like, a response that simply says, I agree, this is a great idea, doesn't cut it, right? Sometimes it's easier to tell them what they shouldn't be doing than to provide examples of what they should, unless it's the kind of thing where you can offer, examples that aren't the actual, where there's multiple possible examples. So for an example, I have a discussion question, and this is one of those ones that was created for me that's asking students for examples of checks and balances, recent examples of checks and balances in the United States government. And I give them an old example. I say, look, here's an old example. This is what a good answer should look like. This one doesn't work because it's from the 1970s, so it's like old. But here's what it looks like. This way, I'm not taking any of the current event examples that they could use. That's an interesting suggestion about an earlier test. Yeah, this is all trying to figure out ways to make it work. All right. So let's go on to the third fix, and we're going to do this together. This is going to be interesting doing this in chat. I've done this in person. I've done this in remote. I've done this but it's going to be interesting doing this in chat. So this was the method my high school history teacher taught me. And it involves 3 steps. The first step is to read the question through once, so you've got it in your mind. Provide 5 reasons people do not vote. State your opinion of those reasons. Provide a counter argument for those reasons. Step 2 is underline the keywords in the question. Now, thanks to modern technology, this gets a little complicated. When I was in high school, we were writing things, we had a piece of paper handed to us that had the test questions on it. And we were able to, underline the words on the question, and we were able to do the next part of this on in our blue book, that kind of thing. Now, if we're talking about online classes, people are taking these tests online. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share a different screen. What I've done is I've copied and pasted the question into a Word document. So we have to think about like how we're setting up our exams in terms of what our students can do here. If we want our students to be able to use a method like this, we need to be cognizant of how we set up our tests, particularly if these are online, right? If we're in an in-person classroom and they're handed a physical piece of paper, it's very easy. Or we're in an in-person classroom where we're monitoring their behavior on a computer, we can walk around and we can see that they've opened a Word document and they've copied it into the Word document. Or they've written the question down on a piece of paper that's a scratch piece of paper that they're using to set up their answer. If you're in an entirely online class and you're using some kind of proctoring software, right? The proctoring software may not let you open up a Word document online. And it's certainly not going to like if you look down to write on a piece of paper, right? You're going to get flagged for cheating. So you need to consider those realities if you're using those kinds of proctoring software. Even if you're not, you need to consider whether or not your testing method is set up in such a way that a student can be in Canvas or Blackboard or whatever at the same time that he or she is in a Word document. So this becomes a balancing of concerns about cheating with concerns about giving students the ability to actually use this kind of method to answer their questions. The way this is going to work is the way I give my tests. My online tests were always take-home exams. I gave my in-person classes take-home exams before online was even a thing. Part of that was because I had really bad eyesight, so the blind woman standing in front of the classroom does not exactly deter cheating. So I was told in my first job, oh, just give them, a take-home test. And that's why a lot of my questions are higher order thinking questions, because it's the assumption is that you have access to your notes, you have access to your textbook. And now in modern times, you have access, to other resources as well. So I give my tests with the assumption that they have some of this access. But let's go through this. So the first step here is read the question. Provide 5 reasons people do not vote. State your opinion of those reasons and provide a counter argument for those reasons. Now, if I'm copying this into a Word document, it becomes much easier, or I'm copying it on a piece of paper. If you're the kind of person that likes your stuff separated, to simply separate it, right? This is going to help me see my answers better. I can simply separate it. Step 2 is underline the keywords in the question. So this is where you guys get to participate. If you could just write in chat what you think the keywords are that I should be underlining. And this is going to be interesting for me to watch what people are writing in chat while doing this. But okay, let's see how this works. In chat, what words do you think should be underlined on here? So we don't want whole sentences. We want to focus on particular parts. Thomas is doing very well here. 5 opinions, counter arguments. Kelly, yep. So we got anyone else going to add stuff? Let's see which ones we got so far. Do we got provide? Hold on a second. So the first thing you guys want to do is you always want to underline the instruction word, right? Provide. In this case, it's provide and state, but a lot of questions are explain, describe, and that analyze, right? So one of the things that our students often don't do is they don't follow the instruction word, right? We may ask them to reflect on something, and instead we get a summary of whatever it is they're supposed to reflect on. Now, sometimes that's because they don't understand what it means to reflect, but a lot of times it's because they haven't closely read the question. So you always want to make sure that you're underlining your instruction word. 5 reasons. Oops. Right? Don't vote. It's important that it's your opinion. A lot of times, I have this right now in one of the essays. I have students that are just finishing up writing in one of my classes right now, where they've been asked to give their opinion of an author who writes about the 7 deadly sins of students. They've been asked to give their opinion about whether they think these things are actually deadly sins of students. And I'll get a thesis statement like, there are many people with many different perspectives on whether these sins are these things are sinful. Well, that is a nice thesis statement, but it doesn't answer the specific question they're asked. So if you've got a word like you want to do that. The word each is not in this question, but if it were, that would get underlined, which would help students to recognize that, provide counter arguments. So now the next thing in the third step of this that my history teacher taught us to do was to create an outline. And again, much easier to do on a piece of paper than in a Word document. I'm not going to bother to try to put a graph in here. But in a Word document, you're creating a graphic organizer on a piece of paper, right? So I need reasons. Let me get rid of the underline. So folks can put in chat. Let's come up with reasons people don't vote. Let's see what folks have got here. Why don't people vote? Yeah, phrasing of questions is important. Access. Don't care. Everyone's favorite answer. What else, guys? I got 2 here. Time constraints. No time off work, no candidate they like. By the way, access, Jennifer, you want to clarify what you mean there? Perceived lack of impact, right? They think it doesn't matter. Kelly's like, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. Transportation. Okay, that's a good one. All right, so let's just, I'm going to randomly choose 5 of them to put on the list here. All right. Lack of transportation. Yeah, okay, now. I'm human, I can't spell. Okay. No time off from work. Don't think it matters. What else did folks come up with here? No candidate they like. Now, I'm not going to add don't care to this one because we already have they don't think it matters. Don't care and don't think it matters may or may not be different things. This is one of the other ways that students sometimes get themselves in trouble on these kinds of questions. They give answers that mean the same thing, or one is the subcategory of, in other words, if somebody had written they're not eligible to vote, and then as another choice they'd written they're under 18. Under 18 is part of they're not eligible to vote. Only because this is one that I hate. Yes, it's raining. I have been told that is a reason why people have not voted. All right. So we have 5 distinct reasons here. You can look to see we have 5. The way I do this when I'm doing this in a classroom or when I already have it prepared as a kind of demonstration thing is I do create the grid, right? So the next thing over in the grid, if I was going across, but I have this in large print, so there's not enough room on the piece of paper, would be opinions of the reason. So I'm going to do it below here just because this is the spacing. Part of the reason, by the way, I have this is so large just so I can see it. I'm not sure that if I made it smaller, other people may be able to see it. But so opinions. So again, that underline. What are some opinions of the reason lack of transportation? Right. So what are your opinions of that reason? Let's see if we get people to not make the mistake we mentioned earlier. What do folks come up with here? Okay, does Thomas have an opinion here of the reason? What do you guys think? Is this an opinion? Is he offering an opinion of the reason, or is he offering an explanation for why someone might not have transportation? Yeah, he's offering an explanation. This is what a lot of the students did on this part of the question, right? They fell into the trap of and again, no, Thomas, you wouldn't. Not at this point. See, Thomas wrote, I'd have to give a full Marxist account of, and again, no, because we're not looking for an explanation of whether the reason is good or bad, right? We're not looking for an explanation about why people don't have transportation. I can look, I'm legally blind. I don't drive. I don't have transportation to the polls. I happen to be able to walk to my polling place, but I don't have transportation to the polls. I would have to get an Uber or get a ride or whatever. There's not even public transportation that works. But that's not the question. The question is whether that's a good or bad reason for somebody not voting. Okay. So trans answer that it's valid for certain people, right? Is probably is a strong start in the answer here, right? And if the expectation was then that somebody explained why, we could have a whole conversation about people not being able to afford transportation, people not being able to drive, people, not having access to the one vehicle in the family because somebody else has it at work, or right. So we could say it's a valid reason for some people because they can't drive a car, right? But if I said that I can't get to my polling place because of transportation, I live in walking distance from my polling place. So that's really not a good argument for me to say I'm not going to go vote, right? I can just get off my butt and go walk down to my polling place. So right. So now, but the first thing you need to do on this question is we need to come up with actual reasons. So if we go in here, right, the opinion of the first reason, lack of transportation, is valid for some people because, and then we can give all the kinds of explanations Thomas gave, right? So it's valid for some people because they can't drive, don't have cars or access to public transportation. But not valid others, right? Such as those who can walk to a polling place, get a ride from a friend, right? Now, I will tell you that when I graded these, I wasn't necessarily looking for that only that answer, right? If somebody gave transportation as an issue. You could argue that it's never valid. You could argue that it's always valid, right? As long as you supported your position, I wasn't necessarily, I was looking for thinking. I was looking for an opinion, number one. And number two, I was looking for thinking, right? So you could argue it's never valid because of absentee ballots. You can get away with that in a 100 level class. If it was a class where we were actually discussing in detail rules related to voting, I'm not so sure I would have let you get away with that because not everybody who lacks the ability to have transportation to polling places is eligible to vote in all states by absentee ballot. That's true in New Jersey. It is not true everywhere. But again, I wouldn't expect people to know that in a 100 level class if that wasn't discussed in detail. If we were in an upper level class where we went into great detail about voting rules and laws, then there's a higher expectation for what counts. So let's go to the next one. The second one was no time off from work. What do people think about that as a explanation for not voting? Good, bad. Again, think of the adjective. Or another way to put this is initially a one-word answer. It's a one-word adjective before you justify your position. There you go. Thomas has got it, right? And he also got the little voting lesson that some states are nicer than others. So Kelly, again, in a 100 level class, you get away with that answer. It depends on whether you're part-time, whether you're full-time. It depends on vote. Again, it depends on the state. It depends on what voting hours are, right? Most people don't, the polls in New Jersey open at 6 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. Most people are not at work from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. What oh, Thomas, you're from Texas? Yeah, you guys know about making it hard for people to vote. Oh, yeah. Right. So the reality is, right, we're going to pick on the Texans for a moment. So, right, you may be in Texas, right? Problem is you got to commute to work, you got to get home, and the polling place lines, and I'm going to pick on Houston, are like a zillion hours long because they're going to have as few polling places as possible because they don't actually want people to vote. I mean, yeah. Right. So again, part of this depends on how you support your position, but we're going to stick in here reasonable. All right. Number 3, don't think it matters. So how do we respond to this? You see, Thomas, I'm going to make you jealous. It took me about 15 minutes to go vote for president. We have nice small voting districts. That's about 100,000 people in my polling place. All right. Sorry, buddy. All right. So back to our third reason. Don't think it matters. Good reason, bad reason? What do folks think? So disagree is not exactly right. We've got Andy here who says disagrees because the math sometimes actually it is very close. And I can tell you, as somebody who won an election by 50 votes many years ago, every vote matters. But again, disagree isn't a judgment about the reason. It says you disagree. So it's maybe a weak reason, it may be a strong reason, it may depend on the election, right? So if you're like a Republican in California voting for president or a Democrat in Texas voting for president, you can make a stronger argument that your vote isn't really going to have any impact because it's not going to change who wins the electoral college votes for those states. But if you're voting in a school board election, which is what I won by 50 votes, then yeah, it's a much smaller electorate and there's much more likelihood to make a chance. So again, this is another one that you can kind of argue by saying, is it a good reason? Sometimes. All right. By the way, the other part of this though is there are people who will say it doesn't matter because it doesn't matter who wins, right? It's not a matter of my one vote changing the outcome of an election. They'll say it's a great reason because they're all a bunch of crooks and they're all terrible and we're all screwed anyway, or whatever their position on politics is. So you will get those arguments as well. Yeah, it does depend on your political philosophy. If you're an anarchist and you don't think the government should be involved in anything, you might get a different answer there. All right, number 4, no candidate they like. This is a big one. Again, what do folks think on that one? You're reasonable. Yeah, this one is really a matter of opinion. This is, you can argue this all different ways. Some people will say vote for the lesser two evils because what public policy will be different if you elect, candidate A versus candidate B. Other people will be like, no, I'm not going to hold my nose and vote for somebody. What I'm going to do, since we have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to finish through this, and the second part of this is I'm just going to play fill in the blank for the rest of these. So the 5th one was it's raining. I once had a voter actually tell me this. I was doing phone calls on election day. Have you come out and voted yet? And this was somebody that was tagged as a supporter, and the person said, it's raining, I'm not coming out. So I'll put lousy. Now, the counter argument section. This is, some of you guys already mentioned counter arguments, but again, you're going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So lack of transportation. We're going to play that we're in the state of New Jersey, and in New Jersey, we have anyone is allowed to vote by mail who wants to. It's no excuse. You just have to ask for a mail-in ballot, and you're allowed to do it. So for no transportation, the counter argument would be get a mail-in ballot. Now, in a place where that's not the case, Texas, Wisconsin, there's tons of states where that's not the case, the counter argument becomes much harder to make, right? Because then it becomes part of, you've got a great explanation. Let's see if there's ways you can get transportation to a polling place. But that's, it's a much harder argument to make make an argument there. The second one was no time off from work. Again, this depends on whether you have early voting, vote by mail options, right? So your counter argument in New Jersey is get a mail-in ballot. We instituted early vote this year, so vote early on your day off. All right. The third one, don't think it matters. This is a lot harder to counter argue. This is, you might want to argue that the outcome affects public policy, affects your taxes. It affects, something you care about. It affects the roads, affects environmental policy, whatever. Something that's different between the two candidates that would be running. I kind of went more national kind of stuff, but except for roads. No candidate they like. I will tell you that Again, this depends on the knowledge people have. I have actually voted for writing candidates on occasion for some local offices because I didn't like my choices, just to be counted. There are people that say that if none of the above is a choice and people had to go out and they could vote none of the above, politicians might change how they actually behave. Um, and again, your fifth one, our reason was, where were we? It's raining. So the way this essay now writes itself is there are 5 reasons people don't vote: lack of transportation, no time off from work, don't think it matters, no candidate they really like, or it's raining. Well, in terms of the first explanation, I think it's valid for some people because they can't drive their cars, access to public transportation, etc. However, in the state of New Jersey, we have all mail-in voting if you want to vote that way. So please go out and do that. The second explanation, no time off from work, is reasonable given that reality for certain people. But in New Jersey, we started mail-in voting and early voting. Here's how you can. So you literally go through the 5 you go through the 5 things that we have and you write your essay. By the way, the history teacher that created this used to actually look at our outline if we ran out of time to see if we had the other points in there to get partial credit. So that was a motive for doing the outline. Very quickly, let me share my screen back to the PowerPoint. All right. So I'm going to skip this to the running out question for the chat discussion because we're almost out of time. Speaking of running out of time. So this is what my students told me about why they run out of time. A lot of them, because you're typing on a computer, if you're giving an online test, will go back and revise while they're writing instead of getting the whole question answered first and then going back. So I had to actually tell them, no, finish your essay first. So you've got everything covered. Then go back and add to it and revise it and clean it up. This way you're within the time frames. Wandering off topic, again, if you use the kind of method that I just showed, and they literally check off each thing as they're doing it, then you're a lot less likely to wander off topic. Number 3, not being aware of the time or having a sense of how to manage it. The first part, again, watch the clock. The second part, if this is in person or in a remote setting, you can give them time warnings. You can also give them a sense of how long it should take to answer each question, which may help them. In an online test, allowing themselves to be distracted by things that are in the home environment or where other environment they're in taking the test. So I'll have students who will tell me things like, I got distracted because, the cat came in or my kid came home or whatever. So that's just encouraging people to work in distraction-free environments. We literally have I think 3 minutes left. So if folks have questions, I put them in the chat. Well, I hope this was helpful in terms of ways to, I do want to make a point. When you're phrasing your questions, this part about people not knowing the meaning of words, keep in mind that you have diverse communities within your classroom, English language learners, people from different lived experiences, people with disabilities that may have difficulty with figurative language. Try to use language that's as accessible as possible so that you have less of that issue. I'm glad that this was helpful. Thank you. Thomas, I had fun with you. I enjoyed your answers. Very thoughtful. We could have some great political discussions at some point. I'm not sure what you teach. I hope everybody has a good rest of the conference and that we all get positive things out of it. Thank you all for participating, by the way.